Welcome to your next tech startup, the podcast exploring why startup hiring is tough and interviews suck. Host Isabel Rasmussen, a head of technical recruitment, draws on over a decade of experience along with expert guests to unpack what's broken and how to fix it. Let's dive in.
Welcome to your next tech startup. Today we are talking about growing and hiring from a team of 0 and how that changes as you go to a team of 100. We have Michael as our guest, and he has founded 3 startups, one of which he grew to 100. And so he's made, hiring decisions for a few hundred people at least over his career, not just engineering, but, we're going to be talking about just overall kind of thinking about hiring for startups today.
Hey, my name is Michael Cioni. I'm a serial entrepreneur, multi-time CEO, and I actually work primarily in the creative space. So I build tech companies and technology service companies for creative people. I've worked on over 150 major motion pictures. I'm a member of the Motion Picture Academy, the American Society of Cinematographers, and I'm a U.S. patent holder in some of the tech that I've developed. And so I'm always looking for technology edges to help creative people tell their stories.
Awesome. Yeah. And it's exciting for me to have someone on who's very much in the tech space, but also outside of just this pure deep tech that oftentimes my guests are in. Right now, you have a team that is in that kind of 0 to 25 space, and you're deep in the how you're thinking about hiring for that team right now. What would you say are some of kind of the key things that differentiate that hiring time for you?
Well, yeah, this particular startup is called Strata, and Strata is in its 23rd month at the time of recording this. So that's still very early. We're still in that seed round space. So we only have 12 employees. And so what's so critical in that first, 25 employees is to be able to identify people that wear multiple hats. One of the mistakes that you have to trade off that I've made before is you try to look for experts that are like subject matter experts in one space, and we index on that because those people are really exceptional at one thing. But when you're small, that often can be alienating in a way. One example is if you have someone who is really good at one thing, it means that the entire tech stack pipeline of your product design and engineering staff, you have to make sure everything's lined up to make them able to work 40 plus hours a week. And the problem is because of so many changes and rearranging and even pivots involved in doing a startup,
It's not going to be lined up.
Yeah, they're not all lined up and the people are not ready. So that subject matter expert, that engineer that's exceptional at that one thing is waiting there twiddling their thumbs. So when you give them the thing to make, they're great. They can do that. But the problem is it's hard to keep that system totally full to the brim 40 plus hours a week. And so having someone that may be a little less expert, but a little more well-rounded ends up being a benefit for getting your best dollar market value for the amount of hours people spend to build, especially in the early stages.
You've given such like an amazing explanation of that and why that's so important, because it is a collaborative work environment. And even if this, 10x engineer or whatever can like put these things out, are all these moving pieces and, the ambiguity and kind of chaos that goes with early stage startups. And so what's, most critical in that first 25 is that you're finding people that can be successful in that. And one of the, the wear a lot of hats things, one of the early episodes that we recorded, Mark was on, and he talked about how it's not just you wear a lot of hats over a 6-month period. For 1 month, I can do this. And then for 3 months, I can do this. It's in a week or in a day. When we talk about wear a lot of hats for early stage startups, really understanding that you have to be able to pivot and adjust and change during that day. There isn't this, okay, you have 2 weeks to adjust to this.
I often say that like whiplash is part of the plan. And a lot of times established orgs look at whiplash as bad management. It's like, why am I feeling all this whiplash? What I try to do is calibrate people to expect it. This is like being on an old wooden roller coaster. It's supposed to squeak and creak and move, and that's part of the fun of an old wooden roller coaster. And if people aren't calibrated to that, they actually look at the whiplash as a bad thing, and so they think you're doing something wrong because we're not planned and it's not super, tight and the wheels aren't greased perfectly. In a startup, you can't plan for that. You know, the old Mike Tyson quote, everyone goes in with a plan until you get punched in the face. And that's exactly what you should expect. So I actually, you know, our tech stack, we build in Rust and React. And so when we're looking for engineers, we're looking not just for your traditional front end or back end or full stack talent. We're looking for people that are hungry to learn a language maybe they don't yet know.
Yeah.
And sometimes, like our backend, our infrastructure and securities engineer, he is an exceptional architect when it comes to Kubernetes. But because we needed additional help on backend support for some peer-to-peer technology we're developing, we needed him to learn Rust. And because we hired him with the premonition that that might actually be part of his job description, he didn't look at that as whiplash. He looked at that as opportunity. And our head of engineering, he was able to start priming the pump months in advance, saying, hey, I just read this article, check this out, come to this meeting, listen to what we're discussing here, and got him warmed up so that by the time we needed to address his Kubernetes to Rust ratio the other direction, it actually felt like it was prepared and it was on purpose. And that allowed us to get, particularly with that hire, we have both a Kubernetes expert and now a Rust expert. And normally in a startup, you might assume you have to hire 2 people for that role. And this would be a way we can get around that.
He wasn't from your network, the Kubernetes expert. Is that correct?
He came through a referral. So, you know, it's that world of who you know and who knows you. Yeah.
So came through a referral, but in the interview process, what were some of the things that you did to kind of set the expectations so that you're at where you are now with him being an expert in Rust as well, and that you set that expectation, and then you also in the interview process made sure that that was a realistic expectation that he could fulfill?
Absolutely. I think you'll really find this an interesting answer. I found some of the worst hires I have ever made in my career are hires that are based on the shiny object. When they have the shiny object, that may be their personality, that might be their history, their Rolodex, their experience, or a product they worked on that did very well. We get so excited about those that we often think that getting them to work for us is like the reward. So we have to sell them to buy into our vision and our product and be like, we really want you here. So you end up selling the job to a person. And almost every time I've done that, I've totally regretted it. If you find yourself trying to convince someone to take the job, first of all, you're giving up all your leverage, which isn't strategically to your advantage. And second of all, you don't actually really know if this person is a good fit emotionally or perhaps professionally, even if they are a good fit technologically, right? Or creatively. And so what I tend to do more often than not is try to convince people not to take the job. And this is what I call the Ernest Shackleton approach. Ernest Shackleton was an explorer a century ago trying to create a map of crossing the polar ice cap of Antarctica, and he failed. He was a successful failure in a way. And the reason Shackleton was so kind of quasi-famous is he placed a want ad, and it is if you Google the Shackleton want ad, you'll see that it says like, I'm wanting people for a hazardous journey. There's no light. It's super cold. I'm not going to pay you very much, and you're probably going to die. That's the want ad. That's amazing, because think about it. The people that signed up for that had nothing to lose. And all the leverage was on Shackleton's side because he promised them nothing.
Yeah.
And they had to be in it for their own fortune and glory, which he says is doubtful. In the ad, he actually says survival success is doubtful.
Yeah.
And so when you're a startup, you need to understand we have a lower success rate than restaurants. And everyone knows starting a restaurant is like taking a bath with a toaster. So this is even worse. And we have to be honest with that. And if we help our hires understand that you're taking a tremendous risk and success is doubtful, only the strongest of the strong are going to say, okay, I'm still in, after you try to convince them not to take the job. And every time I do that, I end up not only with people that have the grit that is needed to get through those first 2-3 years, but you also end up having people that eventually become strong leaders across the org. And as you build, those people are promoted up and actually run departments, and they actually have full stack and full business visibility, and they can extrapolate stories and experiences from days long before most of the hires were even employed.
I think what you bring up is so on point, and I wish every early stage founder could hear that, because I was just having a conversation with a CTO this week about he's kind of getting frustrated with how much he's having to sell versus evaluate with the candidates that they have chosen that they think are going to be their best fit. And I always try when I am interviewing to balance. These are the things that's great, but like there are things that suck about being a part of a startup. With ownership comes a lack of process because you can't own everything. That's awesome that you want the ownership, but have you really thought about the flip side of that? And trying to help your candidate understand this is what's going to be like cool and great about like being a part of an early stage startup. With that comes this, and you need to be able to thrive with both of those things.
Well, you said something. You said you wish the founders would understand some of these principles, and what you were saying made me think of something that both can be valuable for founders to understand, but also engineers and talent who are being courted or hired. And that is, I find, and this is not a direct criticism of a single person, but it is something that if we deep down dig, we understand is true, and it's not very good. And that is, a lot of times experience and flexibility become at odds with each other. And we, over our careers, as we get more and more experience, we become more and more inflexible. And this is really important for both the founders to understand that sometimes they're going after pure talent. And if you understood the relationship that a lot of times the higher in the talent pool someone becomes, the less flexible they become, that might be a bad fit, especially early on. Likewise, if you are an actual candidate and you want to be more valuable to people, you need to understand that your experience and talent makes you somewhat inflexible. We all can tell a story of someone who is wildly talented, but they just said, this is how I work. We're doing it this way. This is the way I always know it's done. This is how I do it. And when they get on these teams and say, yeah, but could we explore this and that? How about this? No, this is my process, right? And you hired me for my expertise, didn't you? We've been in these meetings, right? And it's like, yeah, I did hire you for your expertise, but I need a little flexibility here. Well, and then they think it's a criticism, and it's not a criticism. It's certainly not an attack. It's a need. Flexibility is a component of being professional. And I actually think the more experience we get, the more flexible we need to work on becoming. And I can be inflexible too, because I have my expectations and rules and certain things that I kind of don't move or budge very easily on. But the older I get and the more I do this, I realize that flexibility is more important in many cases than talent. Because someone who's talented that's inflexible ends up creating more damage than they may inadvertently mean to. It's certainly not intentional damage. These aren't malicious people. Yeah. But flexibility is key. And that's where I think being upfront and being trustworthy with being honest with your hires and being like, I need you to be flexible. How flexible are you? That's a question you should ask 2 or 3 versions of that question in an interview. About flexibility. Give me an example of some flexibility. Give me a time where you actually had to change course, or give me someone you worked with that was inflexible. What was that like, right? Those would be good questions to ask them. Yeah. And then on the other side, if you're a candidate, you need to think about these things ahead of time and ask yourself honestly, am I more or less flexible than I was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? And depending on that answer may change what you think is a good fit for you professionally.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've had that conversation with a lot of engineers who have done decades in startups, and a lot of people have been laid off in the last couple of years. And I often say, do you have another startup in you? Can you do it again? That's my friend conversation. That's not my interview conversation. But I'm curious, right when you were talking about that experience and inflexibility, which it is a complicated one, but in theory, someone who's very inexperienced is very flexible.
That's right.
But it's hard to take on a lot of ownership and steer yourself versus being steered when you have no experience. So do you gravitate towards hiring people with minimal experience, or what are your thoughts on that? Like the super flexibles?
It's a great question. And I just want to reiterate, you said it exactly right, because it means the less experience you have, the more flexibility you have. Everyone knows when they were 18, 19, 20, they're like, I'll do anything. You're all flex, right? Because you're like, I don't even know what I'm going to do for a career. If you're willing to pay me anything, I'm willing to consider doing it, right? So that's all flex, no experience, right? So we understand there's two halves to this. My approach is, it depends on the department and it depends on the role. And so you have to gate yourself and be like, which roles can I take a higher risk at a very flexible, low experienced person? And I call that the cabbage patch approach. Cabbage patch is where you're going to grow and cultivate talent. And here's the good and bad. The good is they're going to do it your way. They're going to grow into the company. They become extremely loyal, or they have the potential to become very loyal, and they see ways to upgrade through the business. Other people get rallied. They feel good when they see people come in and be promoted. That's a good sense in a healthy business. The bad news is it takes a long time. You're paying them to learn, and luckily you pay them less at the very beginning, and eventually they earn more. But it takes years to really cultivate that cabbage patch. So some departments, I will bring in people who have less experience and trade that off for flexibility. Plus, I gain the potential of having 2 or 3 hires for the price of one super experienced person. And depending on the department that I'm putting that in, I may be able to do that. And then likewise, on the other side, when I have a really scary situation that really requires someone extremely experienced, let's say it is infrastructure and security or something like that, I really need to make sure that I'm using the Shackleton approach and find the right person, because I can't afford the time for them to learn on the job on something that is as critical as INS.
Yeah. And then, our plan was to talk about the 0 to 20, 20 to 50, and 50 to 100. And I think everything that we're talking about right now also goes into that. So in my mind, I mean, funding also is like part of it. It's kind of like if you don't have enough money to pay senior software engineers, and I don't oftentimes get opportunities to bring new grads into any kind of role, but I think you bring a new grad in and let them potentially sink or swim, because if you're, the seed stage startup and you don't have enough money and you're not going to have the people, you don't have a leadership team to help that person be successful. So they're going to have to figure it out on their own. So that is an approach. With how you do things and thinking about that 0 to 20, 25 to 50, and 50 to 100, at what point are you most comfortable with making those early career hires?
Yeah, I think I do it in every stage.
You do?
And
Okay.
every stage needs to have those cabbage patch, but the cabbage patch risk changes, and how many of them you can take on at once changes. It's easy to grow a larger cabbage patch when you have 100+ employees, because you can invest in a future that's going to bore out 4 or 5 years from now. And so you could put 5 or 10 employees, 5 or 10% of your employees are new. That might be totally feasible at the beginning. Maybe just 1 or 2. An example that we have is when we started, one of the things that's really important about our product development is we have we have a lot of tenets, but one of them is that design must stay ahead of front end.
Okay.
And it's critical that the front end's never waiting for design. And most people would agree with that, or most people would, say, yeah, but for us, it's really critical. And so we had a great designer that actually came from Fandango. And so he knew media, and he knew web apps and things like that. And he knew mobile, and those were ticking all our boxes. And he was very experienced, but he only wanted to do basically 1 year. He didn't want to do the 3-4 year vesting in the startup. And so what happened is he brought in a protege that was right out of school, out of Northwestern. And that protege ends up learning under him very quickly, first job out of school. And then when he moved on after his vesting cliff ended, she was able to take over. And in short order, our Cabbage Patch graduated very quickly. And now she's designing the product. And I'm so pleased with that transition. And she rose to the occasion that I am almost 100% certain the next hire in design will not only be working beneath her, they will be much older than her. And that is a really good sign of a healthy business, both that you can cultivate a Cabbage Patch growth and also people who are willing to work for people younger than them. Some people have a real problem with that, whether they know it consciously or unconsciously. Yeah. And I think when you get into that 100 people, there is this stigma that goes back many decades that the older group is higher ranking and the younger group is lower ranking. Why? Give me a break. Like, why? That's all changed. The internet has completely erased all of that. Yeah. And I find in my world, which is media and entertainment, a lot of times the older you are, the less you know about technology, tech stacks, and just general networking. And so we find that we have to break these stigmas of ageism, whether people know it or not, especially in that 50 to 100 area. You're going to have a lot of people 10 to 15 years younger managing departments of people that could be 10 or 15 years older than them. And you got to set that up early enough that people understand they respect the person and not look at like their birthday as a reason someone should be promoted or demoted.
Yeah. And I love what your design person did. I've never heard of there being that level of transparency in a hire. So when you hired them, they were transparent about the fact that they would do the work for 1 year. Is that accurate?
At some point that became pretty obvious. Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes.
Okay. So it wasn't like a day one, great, you're going to come on, here's your protege, you're going to train them to be amazing over this next year.
It wasn't the plan. Nothing's, right? There's never really a plan that good. But because everyone was loyal and amicable and communicative, when that became the plan, the conversation became easy to have and the plan started to work. And this person didn't want to leave us hanging. Good people don't want to do that to businesses, right? And it also gives us an opportunity to bring them back someday when we are a little less startup-y. And I honestly, here's a great trick with hiring. If you are really good at hiring people, if you're really good at it, when people leave, you really want them to feel like they can come back. And as rare as that may sound, I have had several instances of high-ranking people that I've lost who have come back. And I mean, it happens enough that it's actually, there's a pattern to it. And so that tells me that I'm hiring the right person. And when that person leaves, they're leaving for the wrong reasons. And then they're thinking about coming back. And the reason I'm so confident in that statement is because as many people as I've had return to work for me, it tells me there has to be a large percentage of people that at least considered it and didn't do it. And that's a good sign that at least we're in their head, which means if we're going to be working for an entire lifetime, you never know what doors open and people can come back. And so you want to make sure that you hug people on the way out, that you support them to the last minute. And I've been at businesses that I've left, and some of them, they feel like they threw me a party on the way out, and other businesses, they threw me out. And it really changes my perception of that business and how I talk about it retroactively in interviews like this and different, opportunities, and if I would ever go back or not. And so you got to really consider, are these people that you're willing to bleed with as long as you need to? And are they the type of people that you're willing to fight to keep? And if you can't keep them, you're still willing to let them know you love them and want them back. And you'd be surprised how long that tail can last if you really anchor that love in deep with people that leave.
Well, you're speaking about it from a founder perspective, which is great. From a hiring perspective, when I'm thinking about bringing in directors of engineering or VPs of product, those type of hires, I am not oftentimes on the last interview loops, I'll do screening calls or whatever. But one of the things that I think I've learned from those experiences working with that person who was hired, and I am their technical recruiter. This is when I was in-house. And some of them had no network. Not that they don't have a network, but I was like, well, you have 5 roles that we need to fill. Who have you worked with before? Who have you managed before that could be a good fit? And to me is such a red flag if they have no one. And I think that the interviewing process, when you're thinking about bringing in those higher ups, and are they going to be someone that is going to support your team, help your team grow, then they should have been that person in other companies. And so they should be like, oh yeah, this person I've brought to multiple companies with me. I've brought this person. One of the best people I've helped him build at 4 different companies, his teams. And so I'm always happy to join him again. But it's not just me, like everybody that I reach out to, I'm like, Robert's hiring. Are you interested? I loved working with Robert. I'd love to talk to you about it, And so that is such a powerful sign of what good leadership is. I think the other thing that you had shared, how much you have to let go of ego to be able to be that person who hugs someone as they leave and understand that it isn't about you, and be able to move past that and be able to see it as, this is a lifetime relationship, and how can I have this lifetime relationship with this person instead of be really upset about what's happening right now and what the impact of this person leaving is.
Yeah, a lot of times people leaving is not betrayal, but we perceive it that way, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of founders, a lot of managers feel that when we have to fire someone, we are actually admitting guilt that we failed. And so part of the reason we allow people to limp along is because we have an ego that's too great to admit we hired the wrong person, which is really ironic because the longer you leave someone that's a bad fit on, you look worse as a manager.
Yeah,
Most of the times,
totally.
if you cut bait quick, your staff that remains will look up on you. They will respect you. Be like, wow, you got rid of that. I remember in my second startup, there was a problem person, but they were really talented. They had loyalty. They just had some details that were missing, and it affected the supply chain of the rest of the org. And people would kind of slowly, quietly bring that up because they were so likable. They were so nice.
Yeah.
They had everything positive. It's that conversation you say, I love them. They're so great. I would never say anything bad about blah, but right. And then here you are. Well, it turns out when I finally realized this and I came to terms, this has to end. Everybody took this huge breath and they said, oh, thank goodness you did that. You have no idea. And then out of the woodwork comes all these stories I was unaware of. And so a lot of times as a manager, you may only see the tip of the iceberg of what the real problem is. And actually the rest of your org is feeling it worse. And if these are great people, personality-wise, emotionally, and things like that, it's really hard for people to surface that stuff. Toxic people are always obvious, right? You understand that. But people that are healthy, that seem healthy for the org, they're hard to criticize. It doesn't feel comfortable. And so you as a manager actually have to be even more surgical with understanding that, trying to create an honest way for you to receive the insight and feedback. And if you're noticing these problems, I'll bet everybody else knows it. And you just have to make a healthy decision. There's a book called From Good to Great. And in that book, the chapter that I like the most is called The Bus. And the idea is that a business is like a bus. There's only a finite amount of seats on it. And when it comes to being a manager or a founder, you are quickly filling up as many seats as you can in the first 2 to 5 years. But when you're filling up 50 to 100, guess what? There's not as many seats left. But you really need some really great people to get on the bus. Managers are typically really good at getting people on the bus. We're good at selling. We can say, this is going to be great. Look at all we've done. We have a great team. You should get on the bus. But there's nowhere for them to sit. And so managers are simultaneously really bad at getting people off the bus. And what happens is if someone was there from day one, we want them to stay on the bus for the long ride. I call this old church lady because nobody wants to fire the old church lady. She's sweet. She's been there forever. And it just feels cruel and wrong. But we have to remember they may have served their purpose. And sometimes you need to get the right people off the bus who were there from the very beginning so that you can make room, because nobody has infinite seats. And that's one of the problems that holds up hiring freezes and things like that, is there's too much mediocrity that has been allowed to live in the business longer than it should have. And if you take that analogy and you filter in the Peter principle about how far you should get promoted, all of a sudden you realize there's a huge portion of your org that's just sitting one step higher than they probably should, taking up a little bit more room than they should, and you're literally preventing you from hiring the notch above that you really need that could take the product off. And most people aren't willing to have a few send-offs or, professional funerals in order to unlock those seats. And this is easy for me to say, it's really hard to do. In this startup, I wanted to put this into practice. This is my third startup. I have fired 4 or 5 people already. That is more in 22 months per capita in terms of my head count.
Yeah.
That's the highest percentage by an enormous statistical margin. I've never gotten rid of that many people because I felt in startups, if they're willing to bleed, I've got to cut them as much slack as I possibly can. And I've done that. My first startup was called Plaster City, which was a post-production company. My second company was called Light Iron. I sold that to the camera company Panavision. Then I joined the startup Frame.io, which we sold to Adobe. And in those stories, getting rid of the right people at the right time is what I was really bad at it at Plaster City. Horrible. I kept people way too long.
Yeah.
At Light Iron, I got a little bit better. And then at Frame.io, I got a little bit better. And at Strata, I got really good at getting the right people off the bus to make room.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point. It's one of the founders that I've worked with. He's maybe on his third startup as well. I think at one time he had 3 software engineers and had fired 4 software engineers.
That's bold. That's rare.
Yeah, this conversation with you is amazing. I enjoy working with founders who it's not their first go around because they've gone through some of those really hard lessons already. And so you can just make a lot happen a lot faster when you have that dynamic. So, kind of going on with this, where we're at right now, it sounds like when you're doing that hiring from 50 to 100, what are the big shifts? It doesn't sound like it's starting to let people go, because you've been doing that the whole time, making sure the right people are on the bus, which is a good reminder that I don't think I've read that book since I was in my MBA program and I need to read it again. But what would you say is one of the bigger shifts that does happen from that pre-50 to after 50?
Well, that's a great question. And the answer is actually something no one knows right now because of the particular time that we're in. And what I mean by that is I find that in my earlier start, my first 2 startups, when you get around 50 employees, that's when you start to struggle to keep the culture under control and you start to lose some of that culture. Now, if you do a good job, the culture will propagate itself in an appropriate way, but your overall control of it changes and it's being influenced by more and more different personalities. And if you hire the wrong people, it becomes inconsistent with itself. And that's when culture just becomes nothing. Like when people say, if I ask someone, what kind of music do you like? And they say, I like all types of music. I go, well, then you have no taste, because you can't possibly like all types of music unless you have no taste. And so when you come to culture, you have to you got to make decisions that effectively are tastes. They're subjective, but you're like, this is what we like and don't like. This is what we believe and don't believe. This is how we feel and don't feel within reason, right? After 50, that starts to get really hard, especially when I started Light Iron. We started that in 2009, and then in 2013 we moved to New York, and we started in LA. We opened up New York, then we subsequently opened up Chicago and New Orleans and Atlanta and New Orleans, and
then you also, you're having so many cultural things going on there. Like there are cultural, and I didn't understand how West Coast I am until I've not spent any time as an adult in the East Coast until this summer. And I was just like, oh, wow, it is so different. The windy roads, whatever, it drove me nuts. You have this cultural shift of you're not all working in your living room together anymore. There's that aspect of it. But then you also have like work styles are very different from
Well,
New
those are the
York.
things you're trying to maintain. Those things you want to hold as tightly as possible. And if you do it right in 0 to 50, those should stick pretty close. Where I think this is really scary and hard right now is only people that have started a startup in the last 3 years would have any idea of doing a startup completely remotely. That we didn't have that before. It wasn't a factor, right? And so when I was at Frame.io, I was literally traveling to New York every 3 weeks from LA until March of 2020, when it all stopped instantly. And then it went all remote. My position is that companies that rushed to support fully remote workforces were wrong to do so. That's my subjective opinion. I understand people wholeheartedly, emphatically disagree. That's fine. But a lot of companies rush to this, let's just go full remote. I think a lot of those companies, if you read between the lines, they are trying to repatriate on that because they're like, ooh, we don't actually want that in perpetuity. But once you ring the bell that you can work permanently from home, it's so hard to unring. People had moved, they had left, they had taken their kids out of school, they've changed their whole lifestyle, and they're just like, hell no. And the employees were like, I don't really want to go there, and you can't make me. Some companies like Netflix were pushing people to understand this is not permanent, this is temporary. And some companies like Adobe were saying this is permanent, not temporary. And once people realized how to do this, it's really hard to shift that culture. And so I decided with my brother, my co-founder, we are all in person. And we knew this would be harder on us, especially with recruiting. But our engineers, our team has to be in Los Angeles. We meet in my house and we have a team that works here. We have 12 people that work here every day. We have one remote person that we decided ahead of time that they were worth being remote. And I personally believe that by forcing people into the culture of being in person, we are not only able to better cultivate a true relational culture where people actually care about each other versus the 2-minute, hi, how are you before the meeting actually starts. We eat lunch together every day. So these are the types of things that I feel from talking to both candidates and to founders to really consider where your position is. And someone's saying, oh, but you could get cheaper labor overseas and you could get more talent in your pool if you just hired all over the country. It's like, I know all that. I'm not as dumb as I look, but I really have built amazing cultures. That's one of my superpowers, is to get people to become lifelong friends and to spend time outside of work together in large quantities. And then they bleed for the business. In my second startup, which I started in 2009, there's still a bunch of employees that work there. And they could have gone on to any number of businesses, but they're still there. That's the culture holding them in, not the paycheck, not the work, the culture. And that is so much more valuable if you can see the long game. I'm playing the long game. Someone's saying hire talent out of state or out of the country and do everything remote and just worry about the Bulgarian time difference and just deal with it. That's the short game. And that may be good for some people. For me, I'm betting big and I need people to fall in love with each other at work so that we can have screaming matches and nobody quits, because that's really what you got to prepare yourself for to be successful in a startup.
And so in-person walks together, lunches, you're not able, when you're at 100, to have lunch with everybody. I mean, are you taking walks with each of those 100 people? And I guess at that point, you're making sure that the leaders that you're bringing in are aligned and that they're having the lunches and they're doing the walks with their team.
Yeah, I mean, you're not getting 100 people to walk down the street. That sort of looks like trouble from a distance. But it's more that you're cultivating what might be considered old school now, because people that made friends at work just went to coffee together. That was normal. Today, it's completely abnormal. It's not that common, especially in the tech space with the amount of percentage that is remote. And I simply find that in the startup, that's just not ideal to build the right team. In fact, we just put out feelers to hire our first salesperson because we have a product that's in a point that we actually built a product enough that you could possibly sell it. So we need someone to come in on sales. So I went to one of my former colleagues and I said, hey, you got any sellers that are looking for a bump and want to be the first in a startup, pre-seed, lots of equity, got the chance to build from the beginning.
Right.
And they were all in New York, and I reached out to all of them, and one said, hey, I said, are you interested in relocating to LA? And one of them said, yes. That was it. And so that's where the conversation can begin. I wouldn't even have the conversation if they weren't even willing to consider it. And while I thought that was going to be a huge uphill battle, because I just got connected to the right person who wanted to live in LA, it's been super simple and easy. And now I don't have to deal with any of those unknowns and time zone issues. And I can start, and we've already had multiple dinners together, so we can already spend time dining. I mean, it sounds so old school, but when you eat with someone, you know, humans are like the only species that actually eat for like pleasure and socially, right? Like it's not just for caloric gain, right? And we have made an entire serious industry around eating, as we all know. But I find so many deals can be made over dinner. And I know people listening know what I mean by that. And it's really hard. It's much harder to do it kind of with this, you know, this screen in front of us. It's not impossible. You can be successful. There's no question. But when I'm doing really tough deals, I want to clink glasses and I want to pay for the meal. And I want to find the right place that's near their office or near their home. And I want to go that extra distance. And it really, and when you tell that story and the company inevitably hears about it and feels it, they start to emulate it. And then they take on those same personality traits and then they propagate that within the business. And however they interpret it and put it in the business, that becomes the culture. And as long as it's founded in, I think, the right foundation, it will really grow on its own really effectively.
And, you know, the talking about like going to dinner and really getting to know people, it did make me for a moment think about bias and that whole interview process where it's like, do I want to grab a beer with them? Which was like a very common, I would say probably like a decade ago, that was a common tech evaluation point almost, you know, as a mom in tech. Well, that's great, but I got to go pick up my kid. So grabbing beers at 6 p.m. doesn't really work with my kids getting to bed. So that aspect of building culture, but also being aware of bias, like how are some of the ways that you incorporate that into your team and hiring?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not a great person to ask that because I'm single and I've been married to my businesses. And so as a workaholic, I like to set the example for the highest expectation, and I look for champions of that. And I understand that that makes the pool of talent that can work on my expectations smaller. I'm okay with that. And as companies grow, it gets easier and easier for people to have that work-life balance. But in a startup, there is no work-life balance. I'm very anti work-life balance. That's my choice. And I'm looking for people who also understand and can, you know, accept that there isn't a lot of life in the work of a startup. If you are interested in doing a startup, I think there's a Steve Jobs video out there. I think he says, like, I'm sure you can start a business being a parent, but he says, like, I don't know how you do that, but I'm sure it's been done, but it sounds really hard. And he's sort of saying, I couldn't do that. And I'm saying the same thing. I couldn't do it with my personal expectations I put on myself. And as a founder 3 times over, with successful exits, I don't look back and think I could have done less. I objectively look back and be like, there's no way I could have taken any more time off than I did, which was probably very little compared to most. But again, this is okay. The founder lifestyle is not for everyone.
Yeah. Well, and I will call out, like, there are women, there are parents that found startups and are incredibly successful. I wonder how they sleep. And I have my own business and I have kids, and I took 5 days off when I had my daughter because I had a contract that I had to make things happen. I was doing offer calls with a 1-week-old attached to me.
Wow.
And that's just life.
That's what I'm saying. Like, there's only a few people who understand that and are willing to do that. And I wouldn't judge anyone who thinks you're crazy. I would just say, I understand what you're describing. And you basically knew what you signed up for when you started a business and had a child, and you probably understood the give and take to that. I think sometimes people from the outside look in and they may criticize the workaholics, and that's fine. I'm not saying everyone in my orgs are workaholics. You don't have to be. But the earlier you are at the beginning, the more dedicated you have to be. And the later stage you get, the less dedicated you have to be. But the compensation changes, the upside changes on an exit. All those things are dynamically different. And in fact, you might find this really interesting. When we hire people, we often give them the choice of, we use Carta as our cap table manager. And Carta, if you're not familiar with Carta, you should absolutely use it as a cap table manager. It makes so much of your cap table management of your startup equity easy. It does it for you. But it also is a great resource for hiring because it will give you the types of ranges in what people's jobs are based on their location and their job title and leveling and experience. And it gives you this, like, the ranges between high, medium, and low, which is great. Well, what we do is we use Carta to produce a mean, and we say this is what the average person in your role is offered, and we can offer you that. Carta also factors in how many points of equity they would get for that role, given our status and our startup. Well, what we then do is we say, if you want more cash, we will take your equity down by 25% and give you 25% more cash. If you can afford it, we'll give you 25% more equity. And you're going to take a cash reduction. And we let the people decide. And I'm always shocked. The people I think that are going to take more cash, they end up doing the opposite and take more points. And other people say, I need the cash and I'll reduce my points. And it's totally fine. Because if we have to give up cash, we get to give the points to somebody else, right? That's fine. And vice versa. So these are also levers that not only can you do as a founder, but if you're an employee and you're getting hired and you're an engineer, if you've got some cash in the bank and you did well at your last job, maybe you should say, hey, what if I took a pay cut? Would you give me more percentage? If you really believe in the product, I actually think you might really thank yourself 2, 3, 4 years from now. It also makes you work really hard because you're working for more points on the back end, and that may tip the scales in some of your performance.
Yeah, I do think in general, when people are negotiating with startups, that's very healthy. And I think how transparent you are about it, that's really how you should think about it. Like, it is a sliding scale in that if you go higher here, you lose here. If you're going to go really high on base salary for that person, your equity package for them should be less. So we've been talking a while, had an amazing conversation. Before we wrap things up, anything that you feel like we missed?
I think the only thing that like, if I were to synthesize everything about this these stages is founders need to be aware of the categorical shelves that come with those major shifts from 0 to 25, 25 to 50, and 50 to 100. That's where I see the largest transitions in change. Culture is just one sliver of what those changes are. There are numerous changes. We talked a little bit about upgrading people and promoting them through those changes and cultivating talent that you grow over time, or hiring a new talent, all that. But I find that 0 to 25, 25 to 50, and 50 to 100 is when things really dramatically change. For people to understand these big shifts when you grow your business, is you've got to really factor in what you feel and believe about remote work, and you got to factor that into that. My experience with the shifts that I described in those scaling, that was previously all during in-work was the norm. It was all brick and mortar. This startup is the first time I'm starting a business where remote is an option, and people expect that, or some people expect that. That's what's changed. That's what's different. That's why I don't think anyone has the answers. You have to just put a flag in the ground and claim something. I've claimed we are going to be in person until further notice. I'm not saying forever. I'm not saying we'll never hire someone from New York. But today, when we're in this extremely vulnerable delicate incubation phase, I'm not going to leave anything up to chance, including a time zone difference.
It's interesting because when I said that 50 and you were like, well, like things have changed so much. Honestly, what I thought you were going to say is AI. Wasn't think that you were going to talk about remote culture, because to me, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what a 50-person engineering team could accomplish 5 years ago versus what a 15-person engineering team can accomplish in a year. So that's one of the things that I think a lot of us are really nervous about, is how many engineers are going to need, new roles in 2026, 2027. But it's also how big can your team be and accomplishing things that used to require teams to be much bigger. And, I know I talk to some people and they talk about, well, you're still growing your teams. It's just you're accomplishing 3 times as much instead of only hiring a third. But that's definitely something I think that we'll see as, startups right now are still in their first 20, how being at 50 and being at 100, how that's going to be different because of AI over the next few years versus what it looked like before.
Yeah, my response to that is good entrepreneurs always end up building companies that are more efficient than the incumbents. That should always be true. So when I started my first 2 startups, I was able to do things, this is long before AI was a factor, I was able to do things faster, better, and cheaper because I changed the rules of engagement. I took advantage of emerging technologies and tools and talent instead of incumbent and expected things. The short story of that is when I started my career, Kodak film and Sony videotape was the only way to do films and video. And when I came here, we started looking at hard drives and digital technologies. And we said, what if there's a better way? Entrepreneurs always should be trying to find a better way to do something the incumbents can't do. And so I find AI is just the next better, faster, cheaper way to leverage. I don't need this department. I don't need this department. I don't need this hire. I can do this better. But it's always been the entrepreneurial spirit. The credo is to solve a problem that hasn't been solved by an incumbent. I think AI is just the next mechanical advantage. Yeah. So long story short, AI is not the thing on the tip of my tongue that's really the big change. I actually think, I think AI is just one sliver of many, many slivers.
Yeah. No, that's a great perspective. And this has been an incredible conversation. You've brought up so many really great points from, kind of culturally, how you thinking about things, leading teams to hiring. And I really appreciate having this conversation with you, and hope that we get to have another one when you're bringing a bunch of engineers on the team that we can reconnect.
Sounds good. Thanks, Isabel.
Thank you.